In her book, Adventures in Prayer, Catherine Marshall tells of the claiming prayer, the chapter on claiming prayer, and tells of an incident back in 1947 when she looked in the fly leaf of her husband's Bible, Peter Marshall's Bible, and on the fly leaf of the Bible was written this statement: "It is the word of a gentleman of the most sacred and strictest honor, so there's an end on it." And this had underneath it David Livingstone. David Livingstone, the great missionary to Africa in the last century. Underneath David Livingstone's name was signed Peter Marshall's name. If you're taking notes, you may want to write this down. I think it is so tremendous, this statement. It is the word of a gentleman of the most sacred and strictest honor. So there's an end on it, or that's all that needs to be said. And so she said, well, what does this mean? And he thumped his Bible and said, "And here are the living words of the living God. And among these words are some of his promises. Many of these promises have conditions, and all that we have to do is fulfill those conditions and step up and claim what he promised." And he said, after he hesitated a moment, he said, "Remember that I promised Peter John, their young son, that I would take him down to the train store this Saturday. I would be a pretty poor sort of a father if I made that promise and didn't fulfill it. Now, if I am conscientious about fulfilling my promise to my son, how much more is God conscientious about fulfilling his word, his promise to us?" And then she inquired further, and he told her of the incidents in David Livingstone's life, the great danger he was under, and he claimed one of the promises of our Savior when he said, "Lo, I am with you always." And in his journal, he wrote this statement concerning that promise of our Savior: "It is the word of a gentleman of the most sacred and strictest honor, so there's an end on it." In other words, that's all that we need to know. It's the word of a gentleman. And found, of course, great protection and great blessing as he very simply took the promise of Jesus Christ and relied upon it. Now, that's essentially what prayer is. Taking the promises of God seriously, the word of a gentleman of the most sacred and strictest honor, and relying on those promises. And the tremendous things that can happen if we take seriously the promises of the Word of God. Now, this morning we're coming into, in the second chapter of Timothy, prayer in the church gathering. And we're going to be emphasizing the very subject of prayer, and at the heart of it is claiming the promises of God. Now, as we come into the second chapter, we come into the second major division of this book. The first major division was in chapter 1, verses 3 through 20, where Paul gave Timothy a charge concerning the false teachers. We come into the second major division, and that's chapters 2 and 3 of 1 Timothy, and we might entitle this Instructions Concerning Church Order. Chapter 2 is going to be instructions concerning public worship. By the way, women, next week we're going to be dealing almost exclusively with you. And I would kind of encourage you to read this passage first before you come next week. But the second chapter is instructions concerning public worship. And the passage we're dealing with this morning has to do with prayer in the church. Then chapter 3 talks about the qualifications for those who are in places of leadership in the church. And then at the end of chapter 3, verses 14 through 16, are some personal words to Timothy concerning his relationship to the truth, or his duty toward the truth. Now, by way of review from the first chapter, last week we did not have the time to spend on these false teachers. Two of them specifically that Paul mentions, as they are mentioned here at the end of chapter 1 in verse 20, Hymenaeus and Alexander. These men rejected holding fast to faith. They rejected specifically, a good conscience. And as a result, their faith, their profession of faith, or the faith that they were trying to teach, was shipwrecked. It could be interpreted either way there. They were shipwrecked as far as the faith was concerned. And Paul, on a previous occasion, we see, by way of picking up what we didn't quite specify last time, delivered them over to Satan, verse 20 of chapter 1, so that they may be taught not to blaspheme. I believe if you'll later on run a cross-reference on this to 1 Corinthians 5 about the man who was living in incest in the church of Corinth and how he was excommunicated, I believe that you'll see that what is being spoken about here is talking about excommunication. The wording is almost identical in this obvious excommunication in 1 Corinthians 5. And here we have the church being depicted as the realm of Christ in a very special way, as these people came together in a body relationship, and Christ had a chance to exercise his headship over the church as the body blended its parts together in prayer, instruction, fellowship, sharing, the observance of the Lord's Supper, and so on. This is the realm of Christ, the church. And he delivered them over to Satan, which would be the world. In 1 John, we're told that the whole world lies in the lap of the evil one. This is Satan's particular domain, is the world. And they were delivered over to Satan that they might learn not to blaspheme. They were cut off from leading others astray by this excommunication, and they also had knocked out from underneath them a false sense of security in thinking that they were all right as long as they were still accepted by the church. They were excommunicated, I believe is what we have here. Now we get into the passage this morning, and we have the word then in verse 1. First of all, then, or it can be translated therefore. And it connects the first chapter with what now is to follow. Anytime you run into a then or a therefore, check it out and see what the connection is. And I believe the connection here is that Paul has dealt in the first chapter with right belief. He has dealt with the false teachers. He was given the charge to Timothy that they might instruct him no longer to teach false doctrines, strange doctrines, and what they were doing. And so he lays that doctrinal foundation in chapter 1, and now he's ready for right behavior. You cannot have right behavior without right belief. And he logically lays the foundation in chapter 1 for right belief, and now we get into right behavior as far as the church is concerned. Now remember, as we interpret 1 Timothy, we must interpret it in the light of its key verse, the stated purpose, and that is found in the 3rd chapter, verses 14 and 15, by way of review. I am writing these things to you, hoping to come to you before long. But in case I am delayed, as we have it here in 1 Timothy 3:15, I write so that you may know how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and support of the truth. So here the stated purpose and the key verse of the book is that Timothy is being given special instructions so that he might know how to relate to the family of God, the household of God, which is the pillar and support of the truth, and how to behave himself in there, and what ought to be going on in the church, and special things we needed to know as far as the life of the church was concerned. So we have this going on as public worship is now being mentioned as we get into chapter 2, and we have this word urge. First of all, then I urge. This is not a command, and I believe appropriately so, that prayer is not something that you can force by way of command. You can't legislate it. It's got to come from inner conviction, and the appeal here is conscience. The appeal is love for God, love for one another. And so the urging now of the apostles to this church at Ephesus and really to all churches, as we'll see, is that entreaties and prayers, petitions, thanksgivings be made on the behalf of all men. So we have this here, and we see also something I think that is very important is to pray first of all. First of all, then I urge that these prayers be made for all men. And you say, well, what does this mean? First of all, does this mean that praying, as we see from verse 8, that various men were to get up and to lead the congregation in prayer? Is this to be the primary, the most important thing that goes on in the church service? Is public prayer on the behalf of men who are qualified. Leading the others in prayer, is that the priority item in the church service? And that may well be. I'm not sure that we can draw that absolutely conclusive conclusion, but certainly prayer is one of the great important things, one of the great things that's not to be just an addendum, and the teaching of the Word of God just be the main thing, and let's get everything else over before that happens, and we'll tack on a little prayer here and there so if we kind of feel a little bit spiritual at points. But it's saying, first of all, now instruction or teaching from the Word may be assumed at this point. And certainly something else that we assume, if there's going to be effective prayer in the assembly, is that there's a certain amount of sharing in order that people might be able to pray effectively. For people just to stand up and to pray without anyone expressing a burden or a need, some kind of a urgency, I think is unrealistic. So I think behind the background here is certainly instruction of the Word of God, and as this passage unfolds, it talks about instruction. The women are to behave themselves in a certain way in relationship to the instruction, as the passage, the entire chapter goes on. So it's not just prayer alone that's being brought in here, but notice the phrase there, first of all. Extremely important, extremely dominant in the meeting together of the church. As Timothy gets instruction how he ought to behave himself in the church of the living God, in the household of the living God. All right, first of all, and we're going to look at the nature of public prayer in the church. We're going to look at its scope. We're going to look at its results. We're going to look at the reasons for it and the manner of it described in verse 8 of this chapter. But first of all, the nature of public prayer as it is in the first part of verse 1. First of all, then, I urge that entreaties and prayers and petitions and thanksgiving be made on the behalf of all men. And these are the various elements that are true in real prayer. It isn't just thanksgiving. It isn't just entreaties and so on. It's a combination of these that make for real prayer. Entreaties, this word comes in the original language from a verb meaning to move. And so it's an expression of petition in terms of a sense of real need. Prayers, the next word there is a general term for prayer, and it's always used in connection with prayer to God, and has the implication, as the word is used in other places, and the implications of the word of reverence. And then petition, which is from a word that means to fall in with a person, to draw nearer so as to converse familiarly, in a familiar way. And so it's an approach to God in confident, familiar prayer, as this word petitions is used. And then thanksgiving. Always prayer should have thanksgiving with it. And it's not really the prayer that it ought to be the type of effectiveness before God unless it has the element of thanksgiving. And this verb be made is in the present tense in the original language, and so it's to be a repeated or habitual thing that's done. First of all, then, I urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgiving be made on a repeated habitual basis on the behalf of all men. And of course, as we look at the church today, as we look at our church here this morning even, we see that we fall miserably short in this area. It was Martin Luther who said this about prayer: to be a Christian without prayer is no more possible than to be alive without breathing. And as what air is to the lungs and what blood is to the body, so prayer is to the individual believer in his life with the Lord, and so prayer is in the life of the church, the body of Christ. And extremely crucial, extremely foundational, great priority that the right kind of prayer go on in the assembling together of the believers in the church service. All right, and now we see the scope or the extent of public prayer in the last half of verse 1 and the beginning of verse 2. And it's universal in its extent. It says, for all men. Now, I remember years ago where someone challenged others of us and said, well, there's nothing in the Bible that says that we should pray for the non-believer. Well, right here it is. It says that these prayers be made for all men. If you connect that with verse 2, you see kings and those in authority, and of course at this time Nero, who was certainly not a believer in Jesus Christ, was the emperor. And so prayer is being urged now in the church meeting for all men, believers and non-believers, all kinds of people. And then he gets, of course, specific here for kings and all those in authority. So we have it being made specific now in verse 2 as far as the scope of prayer is concerned. The kings, of course, this would be the emperor of that day. It would be the president of the United States here in our country. And then others who are in other places of public office, lesser dignity, lesser power, and so on, but still in public office and many times having more influence and more authority than those in the higher echelons of office. Now, God himself has given human rulers this authority, according to Romans 13, which you may want to look up later on, but it talks about human government there. God has given us several institutions, divinely appointed institutions. One of them is the church. Another is the family. The other is human government. And God has given human government for the purpose of maintaining law and order. And it is just absolutely amazing the profound effect that a government under which a person lives can affect their life and their spiritual welfare. Just tremendous implications as far as the government itself is concerned. Now, of course, when a government does not maintain its God-given role and appointment of maintaining law and order, God eventually replaces that government with another one that will. And we see history a whole turnover of this type of thing when government does not fulfill its function and God replaces it with another order. Now, remember again, this is being spoken about in the days of Nero. Nero, this emperor, this cruel, sadistic, extremely sinful man. And prayer is being now urged on his behalf, as well as those in authority under him, and many of the Roman magistrates in the local provinces and so on mistreated the Christians, and certainly there was some rough waters for them to tread as far as the relationship with those that were in authority was concerned. Christian writers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries inform us that prayer for the rulers was always given in the churches in the 2nd and 3rd century in their church meetings, their time together as they assembled. All right, now thirdly, we see the result. We saw the nature of prayer. We saw the scope of prayer. And now at the end of verse 2, the result of such praying. In order that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. Now this is to be the result of this prayer for all men, and specifically prayer for kings and all those that are in authority. In order that we, and I assume this would be the church, might lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. Now, all of society is benefited when the rulers are ruling with wisdom and righteousness and in a consistent way, establishing law and order. All of society benefits, but the church does as well benefit. And here we see specifically, in order that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. And we have here, and again, this is from the original language, the word tranquil would speak more of an outward peace, the absence of outward disturbance, whereas this other word, quiet life, would be inward peace, or an absence of inward disturbance. And certainly this links in with the concept of in all godliness and dignity. And we might sum this result up here of saying to pray for all men, and particularly those in authority, in order that all of our society, but particularly the church, might experience outward peace and inward peace both. Now, we see from this the tremendous results that praying for those in authority brings. And I want to read to you a short introduction here from Bill Bright's little booklet, Our 5 Duties as a Christian Citizen. Bill Bright, the founder and director of Campus Crusade for Christ, writing this little booklet on what it means to be a good citizen. Citizenship in a free country is a blessing from God. A great system of self-government assures every Christian a voice in the affairs of the nation. God wants us to do his will in government, just as in the church and in the home. But we have disobeyed our Lord. We have ceased to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, as Christ commanded. As a result, the moral fiber of America is rotting away, and our priceless freedom is in grave jeopardy. Atheism is penetrating every area of our national life. America is faced with the greatest crisis in its history. We are in danger of losing our nation by default, and with it our individual freedoms and possibly our very lives. If that should happen, our opportunity to fulfill the Great Commission throughout the United States and the world will also be lost, and hundreds of millions will never have the opportunity to receive Christ as Savior. Edmund Burke said, "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. America is the last stronghold of freedom on earth, and citizens who are dedicated to God are the only resource for the preservation of our freedoms, including the freedom to serve Him." It has been reliably estimated that more than half of the people in the United States profess faith in Jesus Christ. Even a small percentage of us, following the simple guidelines contained in this booklet, can be used of God to set this nation on a new course of righteousness and for His glory. And the first thing we have here is, are we praying faithfully for a spiritual awakening in this country? And certainly, along with that, for the leaders in this country. Secondly, are we a registered voter, and do we encourage other Christians to register? Thirdly, am I making a serious effort along with my Christian friends to become informed? Fourthly, am I actively involved in helping to select and elect candidates? And fifth, do I vote faithfully in every election for the best candidate, regardless of the party? Now, in our country today, we have the ability to vote. They didn't have this in the same way, of course, that we have today in the first century in the Roman Empire. And so we have, of course, ways of making our prayers, putting feet on our prayers in a specific way of becoming informed and voting for the best candidate, and even trying to get people who are Christians in office. And what we have here, of course, is a tremendous responsibility and a tremendous encouragement to us. In other words, it's not a waste of our time and our effort to pray for those in authority, because it does bring results. And this is what we are commanded to do here in this scripture, not just as individuals, but as a church. We are to come together as a church, and we are to pray for all men, and specifically for kings or presidents and all those in authority, in order that, specifically, especially the church, might experience tranquility outwardly and inwardly. And that, of course, makes it possible for verse 4, as we see the purpose, which we'll get to in a moment, further, He will have all men to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. I'm impressed as I think of the book of Acts, as it describes the early church in Austin. What did they do when for example, Peter and James were put in prison? James was executed and Peter was there in prison. What did the church do in order to get Peter out? Did they circulate a petition? Did they go around and picket? Did they try to somehow smooth the palm with some funds? No, they got together. The church got together and they prayed all night. They prayed earnestly for Peter's release. And Peter was supernaturally released, for example, as you see in Acts 12. And when he came, by the way, as you know the story there, the church, the people were so surprised they couldn't believe that it was Peter out there knocking on the door. And God answered their prayer, and great, tremendous things, as you study the book of Acts, were accomplished as the church got together and prayed specifically in relationship to their authorities, those that were in power. And the same thing is being emphasized here in this passage, that we are to do something. It's not a waste of time, and God does tremendous things, as you see it depicted there, in order that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. So we need to claim the specific promises of God and believe Him in this way. Now we see the reasons for such prayer in verses 3 through 7 as we quickly look at this part of the passage. We have one of the reasons, first of all, its intrinsic nature in verse 3. This is good. Someone has said this practice of praying for all men is a fine thing in itself. That is, it approves itself to the moral sense of mankind. It's good. That's one of the reasons why we should do this. as we gather together as a church. And then this is also acceptable in the sight of God our Savior. And here's the chief motive for obeying this is that it's something that pleases Him. God looks down, and as the church gathers together and they so pray for all men, and they even pray for those in authority, God is saying in so many words, right on. This is acceptable. This is pleasing to me. All right, and then we see another reason here in verse 4. It's in accord with God's will. It says, who desires all men to be saved. Now, there are a couple of words, at least, in the original language for will or desire. You see one of them used in verse 8. Therefore, I want. That's a strong word, some determination. Whereas the word in verse 4, who desires all men, is a weaker word, and it comes from emotions or inclination. And God desires that all men be saved, but God will not violate the free agency of a man, will not force himself on man, and therefore some men are not saved. In fact, the majority of men are not saved, even though God desires or wishes that all men be saved. And so this does not teach universalism. It does not teach that all men are going to be saved because God wishes it. This is a weaker word for wishing or willing here. And the all men is in the emphatic position here in verse 4. He wishes all men. And you notice in verse 1 is the phrase all men. Now, I like to mark in my Bible. I like to take a pen that's not going to make all kinds of problems for me later on. There are special pens that you can use. But if you mark in your Bible at all, I would suggest that you circle the all men in verse 1, and circle the all men in verse 4, and circle the all in verse 6, who gave himself a ransom for all. These are related. And I believe that actually verses 2 and 3 become somewhat parenthetical, and we can read this as far as the overall crust of the passage is concerned. First of all, then I urge that entreaties, prayers, petitions, thanksgivings be made on the behalf of all men, and then God, who desires all men to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. All men who God desires to be saved. And so the great thrust of this passage is that prayer in the congregation, prayer in the church, is to result in the salvation of men, enabling them to come to a knowledge of the truth. So we have this sequence here, and God has designed it, and He made it very important by saying, first of all then. And the very heart, the very breath of the church is to be found in prayer as we assemble together. Now, Paul mentions at the end of verse 4 the knowledge of the truth. And anytime Paul gets on the truth, he gets kind of excited, and he gets a little diverted. Just like you and I, once in a while, we'll think of something that relates to what we're saying, and we say, well, what was my main point again? I'm humiliated many times when I have to say, well, what is my main point when I start it off? But here's Paul. He begins to talk about the truth, and now he realizes he's not writing this just to Timothy alone. He's writing it to the churches in general. And he wants to make sure that we understand what the truth is. And so he gives us some particulars on it in verses 5 and 6. What is the truth in a nutshell? Now, there's a lot of nutshell statements of what the truth is in the Scripture, and some of them are quite extended as well. But here's one of them in verses 5 and 6, and that is that for there is one God and one mediator also between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. Now, mediator is someone who stands between two parties who are at variance and tries to reconcile them. And because Jesus Christ has the life of God and He has the life of man, He's perfectly qualified to stand in that place and be the mediator between God and man. And by the way, this, by way of implication, shows us that the mediation of saints or angels is unscriptural. There is only one mediator. There's only one go-between between God and man, and that's the man, Christ Jesus, who is not only man, but is also God. All right, now we see His work, and that is in verse 6. He gave Himself a ransom for all. And the idea of substitution is very strong here in this word ransom. It has a prefix before it, which means in the place of. A ransom price in the place of, on the behalf of all. It has a double concept there of substitution. And that's the essence of what Christ did on the cross. That's the essence of his vicarious work, and that is the concept of substitution. You want to know what God thinks of humanity independent of himself? Human good as well as human evil? Well, Jesus Christ, our representative, substituted himself in our place, and we see at the cross what God thought of humanity, human good as well as human evil. They were fit for nothing but to be condemned and consigned to the cross. And there God laid on Jesus Christ the penalty of our sins. And so he became a ransom for all. And the one mediator becoming the ransom for all. This is the truth that Paul is talking about here. And of course, born at the end of verse 6, born or introduced, given at the proper time. As Christ came, was incarnated, and went to the cross, and was resurrected, and Paul, of course, becoming an apostle. Now at the appointed time, this is being proclaimed, the testimony of it. And then verse 7, we see him reinforcing his qualification to be able to proclaim the truth and to be in this role of instructing the churches, and that is that he was a special representative of Jesus Christ. We see this in verse 7, and for this I was appointed a preacher and an apostle, and telling the truth I am not lying, as a teacher of the Gentiles in faith and truth. Now we see in verse 8 the manner of public prayer. Therefore, in the light of all that has been said, in the light of the injunction, the exhortation to pray for all men, specifically among those would be those in authority, kings and those in authority, and that the God's desire is that all men be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. Therefore, verse 8, I want the men in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension. Extremely important purpose here. Just even came from the word therefore, is that somehow all men must be prayed for, and that all might come to a knowledge of the truth. And this is to be done according to our instructions here in the church meeting. Now, there are certain specifics about this, and one is, and by the way, this is in the present tense, that they should pray in every place to pray, and this is in the present tense. In other words, this is a repeated habitual thing. This is for all the churches, as we see also in this word in every place. But we see this word, I want the men. Now the word men in verse 1 and verse 4 is mankind, men in general. But there's a different word in the original that's being used there. It means the male. Therefore I want the male in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension. And this gives us a couple of implications right here, and that is not just special men. It says men in general, here, the males in general. And it's not just for the clergy, which of course the church evolved into rather quickly in church history. Only the clergy would pray. Or just the elders, or just those with special gifts, but men, males, are to stand up in the church meeting and to lead in prayer. And then also, it's differentiates here between the women. You notice in verse 9, likewise, I want women. And there's a distinction being made here. A specific word for male in verse 8, and then women are being contrasted here. And so we ask ourselves, well, should women never pray as the church assembles together? And I'm going to be a little careful at this point and say, perhaps there are times when women could and should pray. In the light of 1 Corinthians 11:5, if you want to look that up later, I'll just read it to you now. This is also talking about the church meeting. And let me simply read it to you as you listen carefully. But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. For she is one and the same with those whose head is shaved. And it talks about women praying or prophesying, but that she should have her head covered while she does it. And so there may be times when it is proper for the woman or a woman to pray in the church meeting. But she should also keep in mind, and it also be done so that the place of the man is not usurped. Generally, it should be the men, and if there's ever more women praying than men in the church meeting, then we lost the spirit and the letter of the scriptures here. And if women pray in such a way that they are not in suggestion to men, then they are out of line as well. But we do have the statement in 1 Corinthians 11:5, and so possibly women did pray and were allowed to pray according to the Scriptures. Now we see the directive holds good for public worship everywhere, in every place, not just with Jewish Christians and not just with Gentile Christians. This is transcultural. And, of course, in the present tense, it means this is what ought to be going on today in the church. That men, in every place, pray, lifting up holy hands. And you see now that the prayers are to be accompanied with holy hands being lifted up. And most of us get a little squeamish when we see people who lift up their hands and pray. And we find it in the Bible. We find the psalmist saying, I will lift up my hands and pray and praise to the Lord. And this was considered reverent by the Jews. It was a common practice among the early church. But again, the posture is not the thing that's the most important thing here. It's the condition of the heart, the condition of the life. And there are different postures and so on, but certainly we have this concept of lifting up holy hands, unstained. In other words, the men that pray should be men whose lives are characterized by holiness. Not somebody whose life has not been carefully cultivated by the grace of God and the relationship of God, but men who lift up holy hands, and then specifically without wrath and dissension. Have you ever tried to pray when you were angry with somebody? Have you ever tried to pray when you were critical of some other person? Have you ever tried to pray for that person? Well, it's an impossible thing first, unless you get your own heart. You get our hearts right, pray properly for that person. And it's impossible really to pray effectively for anyone else if there is wrath and dissension in our own heart. So it's men were praying with prepared hearts, prepared lives, prepared hearts. And why this is, there's other things that can short-circuit our prayer besides wrath and dissension, but this is probably the most common thing. And this is what is singled out at this point in verse 8. To lift up holy hands without wrath and dissension. And so the men are to lead in this way. Now, in the few closing minutes, just a few words of personal application. Personal application as well as application to the church. Obviously, we are falling miserably short in this whole pattern here as a church. Now, I fault myself first and foremost, and I believe that ought to be our attitude. And I ask myself, just on an individual basis, just personally, am I praying for all men as I ought to? On a personal basis, am I praying for those in authority as I ought to? Am I praying that in connection with God's great heartbeat, that all men will be saved as I ought to? And I have to say very emphatically, no, I'm not praying as I ought to on an individual basis in this way. And Billy, one of the passages that challenged me and I thought about more change in my life than any other passage in 1975 was going through the Gospel of Mark in the 9th chapter. While Jesus was up on the Mount of Transfiguration, the disciples who were left below there, were trying to help his father and his son, who was an epileptic. And the boy was demon-possessed, and they couldn't help him. So whatever they did, their faith wasn't strong enough, and so on. And Jesus came down and said, all things are possible to him that believes, and so on, and cast the demon out of this boy. Well, the disciples, who had been such a failure, got him aside a little later on, and they said, well, why is it we couldn't cast it out? And Jesus said, this kind cannot come out by anything but prayer. And I was challenged that here the tremendous, awesome battle that we are faced with in the Christian experience in meeting the needs of other people, and simply to just try to lift this thing by relying on a verse which is fine, many times does not get the job done, and we need to pray. And we are so ineffective and so undisciplined in this matter of really praying specifically and flamingly before God and His power that we need others to pray with. And certainly this is the reason why we have this thing given right here as far as the church is concerned. But I began to pray, and I said, Lord, I need a prayer partner. And my wife and I are prayer partners in a way, but I felt like I needed another prayer partner. And God supplied that, and we've been able to pray together for about a year and a half now in a way that's It just is not possible alone. And things get accomplished that cannot be accomplished in any other way except through prayer. This time cannot come out by anything but prayer. And so I throw out the challenge to our own personal lives is that we're hardly hitting the tip of the iceberg on what we can do in prayer on a personal level. And I believe that we need a prayer partner in order to really do battle, to cope and fight the good fight, even as it's put here in the first chapter. So what about the church? Why is it, for example, on the average church, when they have a midweek service and it's the prayer meeting, why is it so often that these prayer meetings are so lifeless, so emaciated, so ineffective? And I believe one of the key reasons is that prayer, of course, when we pray together, is a manifestation, or is a result of our own prayer lives individually. And if a person is doing little or no real praying, effective praying alone, then when that person leads in a group prayer, you can imagine how emaciated that prayer is. And so as we learn to pray to God and cultivate this relationship with Him on an individual level, we can pray together and find a tremendous release of power that just isn't there otherwise. And many times people can listen to our prayers and they can tell our spiritual condition by our prayers, if they're mechanical, if they preach just little sermons and good wishes and so on, or whether we have cultivated a real and deep personal relationship with God. This comes through in the prayer. And we can test the person's spiritual level, his spiritual vitality, if we know how they pray on any kind of a consistent basis publicly. And of course, the exhortation here in verse 8, as well as the entire chapter, is that the men lead out in prayer, and we see a release of God's power in a way that absolutely could never be done in any other way. And may God enable us, individually and as a church, to fulfill this exhortation here, to fulfill this great heartbeat of God, and see the impossible brought about as we take the word of a gentleman of the most sacred and strictest honor, and through him, on an individual basis as well as in the church, fulfill that and do the things that are otherwise impossible. Let's close together.